Thank you all so much for joining us. We've been away for a little while, but really thrilled to be back for the new year with Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger, who is the founder of Roots Shorashim Judur, and someone who I'd read about and known of for a while, but I hadn't had the pleasure of being introduced to, and through mutual friend I was. And I think these are some of the, when people ask kind of, sometimes they'll ask, they may have asked you, kind of where do you look for hope in a situation in Israel-Palestine where the denial of fundamental Palestinian rights seems so deeply entrenched, and the political situation can seem so hopeless. It's in the stories of people like Rav Schlesinger, and before him the Rav Menachem Froman, another rabbi in the West Bank who really transformed his thinking in really extraordinary ways that I think is one of the places that I do find hope. So Rabbi Schlesinger, thank you so much for being with us. I thought I would just start with just a biographical question. Tell us a little bit about how about where you grew up and the journey that took you to Alon Shvut to Gush Etzion in the West Bank.
Okay, thank you. I was born in New York. I was a member of Young Judea when I was in high school. That's a Zionist youth movement. And Young Judea basically was the vehicle that connected me to my Jewish identity, connected me to Zionism in Israel. I came with Young Judea to Israel during high school for a summer, and then for a year after high school on a gap year program. And Young Judea in those days had a strong historical or Jewish traditional bent, not religious or Orthodox, but certainly talking about Jewish sources. And I became more religiously observant. I wasn't at all before that when I was in Israel with Young Judea for that year. This was 1975-76. And after going back to the States for a year of college, I felt I just had to come back to Israel. I had to immerse myself in Jewish sources. I came to Israel, it's basically my aliyah. When I was 19 or 20, I went to the Pardes Institute to study for a year, if anyone's ever heard of it. Wonderful place, Machon Pardes. And then I continued on to other yeshivot, other seminaries for beginners. And after that, I went to study in Yeshivat Har Etzion, which is in Alon Shvut in Gush Etzion, what they call the Harvard of the yeshivot in Israel. And I became connected to where the yeshiva is in Alon Shvut. Eventually got married, and my wife and I moved to Alon Shvut while I was still studying in the yeshiva. And we've more or less been here since then.
So at this point, when you were making Aliyah and then moving into the West Bank and as an Orthodox rabbi and living in Alon Shvut, in Gush Etzion, at that point, before you started this encounter with your Palestinian neighbors, before that, what were your views about Palestinians, about Palestinian rights, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
So that's really a hard question because I didn't have too many views. Like I think, like many of my colleagues and neighbors, there are things that are just outside of the radar screen. You don't see what you're not trained to see, what your education didn't prepare you to see. So in my case, I wasn't aware of Palestinians, I wasn't aware of Palestinian rights, but I was aware that since Oslo, there was a peace process, and I was aware that it could be, and I'll use the language I used to use then, that the Arabs living would be given back to the Arabs. Again, I'm using language I'd used then. And I remember actually really asking myself if I should be living here, in the sense of, should I be building a house and sitting down roots when the place might be given back? But despite those concerns, I stayed there. So these weren't moral concerns, they weren't political concerns, they were more, I would say, practical concerns.
And so your interaction with Palestinians at that point was pretty minimal.
Minimal is being generous. None.
Mm.
And I talked to Palestinian workers to give them tea or coffee or to say hello, but never had a conversation in any depth, really didn't know who they were or what their identity was, what their life was like. Really, really, really nothing. And that's the case for 99% of my neighbors and the people around here. I say that I was blind.
So tell me, what was it that began to change things for you?
That's, of course, a hard question. Let me say that I apparently was born a liberal. I was born a pluralist. I was born open. And that's expressed itself in so many ways in my life, in my basic disposition, and the way I've related, say, as an Orthodox rabbi, to Reform Jews, to conservative Jews, the way I've related to women within the Beit Midrash, the way I've related to secular Jews. I've always been involved in what's called cutting edge, pluralistic movements, but I never applied that to the Palestinians because they weren't on my radar screen. What began to, you can almost say, bring me to express my core personality vis-a-vis the reality of the Palestinians in which I live is that I spent a few years on shlichut in America, a few years serving as a rabbi in America, in Dallas, Texas. There I was involved in a lot of interfaith work that really, really affected me deeply. It began simply reaching out to evangelicals to encourage them in their support for Israel, but it turned from Christian Zionism and that type of discussion to theological discussion. From there, I got to meet non-conservative, that is to say, liberal Christians and non-Zionist Christians, and I got to meet Muslims, and I founded an organization for interfaith dialogue there in Dallas, Texas, and I was so expanded, transformed, and invigorated and excited by breaking out of my narrow shell and deeply meeting the other and respecting the other. My best friend in Dallas was a pastor, not a rabbi, not a Jewish congregant. We still have a connection to this very day. And when I came back to Israel in 2013, after these years in Dallas, I decided that I want to found an interfaith organization to do in Israel what I'd done in Dallas. And I began to try to meet men of the cloth, Christian and Muslim clergy men or clergy people. And after a few months of that search, I realized that I was barking up the wrong tree. I realized that in America, I know Muslims and Christians as human beings. We speak the same language. We live in the same civil sphere. We go to the same supermarkets, but we pray in different places. So let's meet each other and learn about our differences. But in Israel, I realized we don't even have that common denominator of language of humanity. So I said to myself, Hanan, before you go and try and meet Muslim and Christian clergy people, go try and meet Muslim Christian people. I realized I didn't know any people who were not Jewish. And it was kind of a rude shock when I realized that. And at that point, just about that point, I had a revelatory experience. What happened is that I was driving in my car one day where I live in Alon Shvut in Gush Etzion, south of Jerusalem. And I had with me two Protestant pastors from the US that I'd met in my interfaith dialogue in the US. They came to Israel to visit to see how the visions of the prophets are coming true. They wanted me to show them. And I showed them around how we've settled the land and built settlements and planted trees and paved roads. And as we're driving, I picked up a hitchhiker. And I picked up another hitchhiker. And when the second hitchhiker got out of the car, one of the pastors turned to me and said, Hanan, it was a great thing you did. You just taught us a lesson in Jewish ethics. He said, in Dallas, we've never seen someone pick up hitchhikers. So I said to the pastor, I said, you know, it's not just me. Around here, we all pick up hitchhikers. We have a common vision. We trust each other. And just like everyone else, I do my best to try and pick up every person who puts out his finger for a ride. And at that moment, I realized that I was lying. I realized that I was lying to the pastors, and even more so, I was lying to myself. I said I pick up every person. I should have said I pick up every Jew. I'd never picked up a non-Jew, a Palestinian in my life. And at that moment, it hit me, perhaps because we were all men of the cloth, we're having deep religious discussions in the car, I realized that there's something really wrong with me, that I don't see the Palestinians, or I don't see them as human beings. And that's just one example of things that happened to me that pushed me to meet Palestinians. And then I did, and my life changed. That's another story.
So tell me about that first encounter with Palestinians and what impact it had on you.
I can't tell all the stories, right? Time is already short. From the very first minute that I met a Palestinian woman outside of the context of a work relationship, from the very first minute I met a Palestinian man, a Palestinian boy, my mind started to become deeply, deeply unsettled. Within a few minutes, it was clear to me that I was encountering something that contradicted everything I'd known to be true. I met Palestinians within a few minutes who talked to me about their personal journeys of meeting the enemy and finding a human being, their desire for peace, their work and dialogue. And I said to myself, that can't be. Palestinians don't know anything about peace. And actually, my prejudices weren't deeper. I was really surprised, although I guess it's hard to admit, I was really surprised that they were pretty much human beings. I'll just tell you a terrible story that happened to me. In one of the first 10 minutes I met a Palestinian, he took out his cell phone to show me on Google Maps where he lives. And I remember being surprised that he had a cell phone. How do you say in English? A smartphone. Isn't that stupid? Isn't that terrible? And so I began to become undone, to become confounded as I heard their stories, as I heard them talking about living in Palestine. I thought it's Eretz Yisrael, about the Nakba. I thought it was the War of Independence, and everything that I knew from my history, they knew the same history, but from the other side. And I became within 2 hours of meeting at this event in which I met 6, 7, 8, 9 Palestinians. I became nauseous. I became undone. And then I went on to meet more Palestinians, and we founded our organization Roots. And what happened is it okay if I go on with this?
Please, 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 please. You're the speaker.
What happened is that I began to see that me and my people have built our identity, our self-understanding upon the nullification and the erasure of the other side's existence and identity. And also began to see at the same time in our discussions, Israelis and Palestinians, as they develop, that the Palestinians do the same thing. It became clear that Palestinians go to sleep at night hoping and dreaming the Israelis will disappear tomorrow because they don't belong. And the Israelis go to sleep with the same dream. And then we began to see that they belong here like we belong here. They've been here for generations. They have this sense that they're at home and they're not going anywhere. And we began to see how we Israelis deny their identity, and we base our own self-understanding upon that denial, because we say, Palestinian, there's no such thing as Palestinian, you're just Arab, so go back where you came from, go back to Lebanon, to Syria. There's no such thing as Palestine, there's never been a Palestinian state. And they say to us, you're a Jew, beautiful, the Quran deeply respects Judaism, but it's a religion, it's a faith, it's not a people, it doesn't demand land. So why did you come to colonize a land? Go back to Russia, go back to New York. We began to see how we really don't know the other. We just have constructed an understanding of the other that serves our own identities and our own needs. And after, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 months of these discussions, Ali Abu Awad, who Sorrel mentioned a few minutes ago, he said something like this. He said, Hanan, it looks like we have to find a way to fit 2 truths into one heart. 2 truths into one heart and 2 peoples into one land. And it's true. That's what we have to do. And so we tried to do. We tried to listen and listen and listen more, listen to the things the Palestinians are saying that are like a dagger to our hearts. When the Palestinian says he lives in Palestine, that cuts my heart. And when I say that I'm a Jew who's come home to Eretz Yisrael after 2,000 years of exile, that cuts to the heart of his identity and it nullifies his identity. We're so hard to listen. But we began to see you can't deny who the other is. You can't tell them who they are. You have to listen and let them tell who you are. And then they'll listen when you tell who you are. And it turns out And what I'm about to say, the first year or two when I felt it and said it, it made me almost cry. It turns out that the same land, and I believe the same land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, the same land that is the land of Israel is also the land of Palestine, the same land. What a terrible, tragic fact, but that's a fact of a history, it's a fact of identity. And it won't change, it won't change. That's the way the two sides look at the land. The same land is both Israel and Palestine. And we have to come to terms with that. It won't go away, it won't go away. And I remember after about 10 months of these discussions between Israelis and Palestinians, as we grew and we founded our organization Roots, in December 2014, we formulated a mission statement and a vision statement. And we said that we envision a new social and political reality that recognizes both sides' historical belonging to the same land and grants both sides dignity, equality, and human rights. And when we signed that, I remember like looking at my partners and saying, can I sign this? It like, well, of course it was true, because that's what my Palestinian partners have been saying for the past 10 months. But by saying it, by signing, there's a sense that I'm giving up on my identity. And here comes a really important point. It is, signing that statement was a matter of giving up a little bit on our identity. It's about giving up on the problematic element of identity of exclusivism. That deep understanding that most Israelis and most Palestinians have, that if it's mine, it's not yours. And if it's Israel, it's not Palestine. And if I belong here, then you don't. And what we have to do is to understand that you don't have to be wrong for me to be right. I can be right. It is Eretz Yisrael, and it is our land, but it's also your land, and it's also Palestine, and that doesn't take away from my truth. That's so hard. Yeah.
You talked about these encounters. First of all, I want to just encourage people to put questions in the chat. I will convey them I'll convey some of them to Rabbi Schlesinger. So please feel free to chime in. You talked about these interactions you had, and I wonder, and you talked about a kind of parallelism, but obviously there's also a power dynamic in the sense that just the logistics of a Palestinian and Israeli Jew meeting are experienced very differently, because Israeli Jews have citizenship, they have rights of movement, and I wonder how the experience of the power dynamic, the power differential between you as an Israeli Jew who have citizenship and your Palestinian neighbor who's live under military law, how that power differential impacted the interactions and how you thought about it as you were engaging in these conversations.
So that's really important. When we first began these discussions, these meetings, when we first founded Roots in January and February of 2014, I had no idea of the things that you just talked about. Absolutely no idea. And perhaps there's people here in the Zoom room that think I'm lying. I really had no idea. And as these things became clear, because the Palestinians would tell us what they experienced on the way to the meeting, about the checkpoint, about being stopped, about their fear. As they became clear, these things, it turned out that in a certain sense, one of the purposes of the meetings was so that we Israelis would learn this truth. And I felt that like my preconceived notions, part of my identity was being destroyed in every meeting as I learned more and more about the conditions that my neighboring Palestinians are living under that I had no idea of, and of course that I'm responsible for in a sense of collective responsibility. And then when new Israelis would join, I would say to myself, yeah, part of the purpose of this discussion is for them to experience that revelation and that opening of eyes, that breaking down of the callous, hard outside shell that prevents us from seeing what's being created, the situation being created around us. And I'll tell you that I've had tens, if not hundreds of experiences of Israelis coming up to me and saying, Hanan, I didn't know, I had no idea. Now what do we do? And I'll just tell you, the other side of the coin is also true. I've had tens of Palestinians, not hundreds, come up to me and say, Hanan, I thought you were going to kill us when I first saw you, that kippah and that beard. You're a settler. All you do is carry a gun and kill Palestinians. And they said, I'm amazed that that's not true, that you're actually a human being and you can be a partner. These transformations of becoming aware in the deepest existential sense of the other's identity, the other's life, and in the case of Israelis vis-a-vis Palestinians, of their lack of rights and of their suffering, that's really what it's about. For me, that's one of the main things that Roots is about, that individual micro transformation that will serve as the basis for the macro transformation on the political level that we're hoping and searching and working for.
So we have a question about the idea, we have a couple of questions about the idea of confederation, about the group Land for All. And I wanted just to ask you talk a little bit how you take your vision and what it would actually look like in state form. What would be your vision of how this territory between the river and the sea would be ruled?
So I'm going to take a few minutes for that.
Sure, please.
First of all, Roots is not political. We don't have a particular political plan, but we do have political principles, which I said earlier: dignity, equality, sharing the land. The whole land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea is both Israel and Palestine. I think we're involved in pre-politics, preparing the hearts, the human groundwork for a political solution. So what would a political solution look like? One possible answer that I partially agree with is we can't know, because we don't yet know each other on human level. That's one possible thing we can say. Certainly the hearts are not ready on either side, Palestinians or Israelis, for a real solution now. And that's, of course, I say that with great pain. And I know as a person of privilege, it's easier to say, that's harder for a Palestinian to say it. I realize that. So I see a paradox here when we're searching for a solution, many paradoxes. The one I'll put on the table is that on the one hand, 99% of Israelis, I think, need a Jewish state, without defining what that is, a state that's Jewish in some sense.
99% of Jewish Israelis.
Yes, thank you, Peter. You're right, I stand corrected. And probably between 50 and 75% of Palestinians want a Palestinian state, probably. And on the other hand, both sides want and actually require the whole land from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. Because I personally believe the Palestinians have to get the whole land. And I'm including Haifa, I'm including Tel Aviv, I'm including Jerusalem. As far as their identity goes, they won't get what they deserve. They won't be satisfied until they get the whole thing. And I say that with deep honesty. And on the other hand, I think that Jews, Israelis, also deserve the whole land. That without Hebron, without Shiloh, without Efrat and Bethlehem, our identities won't be satisfied. So there's my paradox. You have to give both sides the whole land, but you also have to give both sides their own particular state. How do you square the circle? So if it's possible at all, the plan that you mentioned that the person who brought forth the question brought forth is what I subscribe to on a level of principle. The plan is called Two States, One Homeland, and it's advocated by a group that I'm part of called the Land for All. And we basically say that we have to create two states, Israel and Palestine, more or less separated by what we call the Green Line, but they cannot be two separate states. They have to be two interconnected states. And the interconnection is on three levels at least. Number one, open borders. You can go from one side to the other without being stopped. Number two, open residency. You can live your whole life on the other side of the border, meaning a Palestinian can live his whole life in Tel Aviv, for example, without getting Israeli citizenship, but as a Palestinian citizen. And Hanan or any other Jew could live in the West Bank / Judea and Samaria as an Israeli citizen without getting Palestinian citizenship. And number three, the third level of intertwining between these two states is the confederation. that creates a union, something like the European Union, or perhaps something like the connection between Texas and other states of the Union. You're supposed to laugh at that point. No one's laughing, okay. And the idea is to square the circle, to give each side their own state expressing their identity, but on the other hand, to give both sides the sense that their identities have not been contradicted because their land has not been stolen from them. That the Palestinians get Haifa and get Tel Aviv and get Yaffo and get Ramla and Akko, and that the Jews, the Israelis, also get Bethlehem and Hebron. And of course, the last thing I'll say about this is it's impossible because it requires trust. But I believe that any true peace settlement requires trust. And we have to develop that trust and empathy.
So we've had a couple of questions about Palestinian right of return. So am I right in understanding that in your vision, a Palestinian whose family was from Haifa would be allowed to return to Haifa, but they would then be a citizen of this Palestinian state based in the West Bank. They would not be a citizen of the Jewish state in which they actually lived.
That's 100% true in the plan of two states, one homeland. I just want to add that I believe that as Jews who know what it means to be exiled from our homeland and to demand the right of return, the Shana Haba B'Yushalayim, right? We pray for 2,000 years to come back home, and we've actualized that right. We who prayed and hoped and yearned for the right of return for ourselves and have actualized it, I don't understand how we can deny that right to Palestinians. I understand it's going to be complicated and there are going to be compromises, but at least in principle, when we Israelis and we Jews say that the right of return, there's nothing to talk about, we're not talking about what happened before 1948, that just seems to me to be putting your head in the sand, and it seems to be a morally untenable position to me. Right.
So I very much agree with you. Our tradition, or at least one interpretation of our tradition, also teaches us, in Shemot, in Exodus that we're reading now, that one of the midrashim is, about why the Jews, when they left, why Bnei Yisrael, when they left Egypt, took all of this gold and silver, was so they would not hate the Egyptians, right? So it was only if they were given what we in today modern parlance would call reparations, that they could forgive, that you could not pretend that we couldn't, and so Palestinian discourse, at least as I follow it, often talks in terms, there's a lot of discussion of decolonization. So my question is, how do you think about this question of historical justice, and what would that mean for Alon Shvut itself, and the people whose land Alon Shvut might be built on?
Yeah, very difficult. I divide between the level of principle and the level of practice, of application. I don't call Zionism a colonialist movement as far as its self-understanding, and I think that's really important. It didn't see itself and it didn't act on most levels a colonialist movement. But I, on this other hand, understand that the way it was experienced by Palestinians, it had the effects at many times in many places as a colonialist movement. I understand that. That's point number one. Point number two, which is really part of point number one, it's really important to me to emphasize what I said earlier, that the whole land is Palestine, but the whole land is also Israel. And it's not just that I came to colonize and to live on Palestinian land. I did do that, but I also came to live on Jewish land. That's the same land. I don't believe that, I think talking about justice and trying to implement justice is very important, essential, but I also believe that there's never going to be full justice to the Jews or to the Palestinians, because there's a contradiction here, as I mentioned 5 5 minutes ago. There's a tragedy here. There's a real tragedy that the same land belongs to two peoples at the same time, and I really believe that. So there's not going to be full justice for either side. But we have to make an effort, and to make that effort, that requires that the Israelis and the Palestinians deeply internalize the truth of the narrative of the other side. I know I'm talking in theory, I'm not talking in practice. What do you want me to say in practice?
I guess in practice, I mean, I guess in practice, and look, these are difficult issues. I'm not expecting you to figure them out. Goodness knows, I certainly haven't. But what about the question of land that Palestinians lived on, that they had lived on for a long time, that has now been turned into a national park or an army base or Tel Aviv University or the settlement of Alon Shvut, all these places. How do you, is it possible to have reconciliation without some, this is obviously an issue we're grappling with the United States not very well, without some kind of response to that? And how do you think about that?
So first of all, I'll say that the way you phrase the question is really important to me, that you put on the table that the question exists not just in the West Bank, it exists in Israel proper.
Yeah, everywhere.
So that's really, really important to put on the table. Number two, I recognize the present injustices that both in the West Bank and Israel proper, the vast, vast majority of land and resources has been and still is being given to Jews and not to the Arabs, not to the Palestinians. That's a present evil that's continuing and I think should stop. Just for example, in my situation where I live, I believe that there should be a settlement freeze until Palestinians are given the same building rights as Jews have. Why should I be able to build an addition to my apartment or build a apartment building which my daughter's gonna buy apartment if my Palestinian neighbors don't have the same right? And that should be clear, not just going forward, but also retroactively. In other words, to right the wrongs, which means Palestinians have to have more building rights today and have more land thawed for building. What is it going to look like in Israel? I'm not in favor of displacing people and destroying houses in order to create justice. I'm not in favor of creating one injustice to right an earlier injustice. There's a very well-known Palestinian demographer in London, I forgot his name, who's now like 80 years old.
Salman Abu Sita, I think you're talking about, right?
Yeah, thank you. So he, by the way, and Israelis who know about him hate him, of course, but that shouldn't bother us. I mean, shouldn't make us feel the same as those Israelis do. He claims that I think over 80% of depopulated Palestinian villages, 1948, are still in lands that are open and can be rebuilt. Of course, in those cases, that it should be done.
Yeah. No, I would encourage people to look at his work. It's for anyone who grew up in a Jewish in a Zionist framework. It's very, very challenging, but I think it's also very important. Can
you say his name again?
Salman Abu Sita. I think he's done voluminous amount of work on very detailed questions of the question of reconstruction of villages, of demography, of where his basic argument is that most Jews in Israel always lived mostly along the coasts and didn't actually occupy very much land beyond that. It's kind of in some ways what his let me go to the question of your relationships in Alon Shvut, and I want to just probe about this a little bit, not because I don't believe you, but because I still find it some ways hard to figure out. For those of many people who know, Alon Shvut, Gush Etzion, there's not a bunch of dummies in Gush Etzion, right? I mean, one of the most intellectual communities in the Jewish world. I mean, truly, truly brilliant people, right? I mean, the most the Harvard of yeshivot, right? I mean, Gush Etzion. I mean, these are extraordinary minds living around you, your friends and neighbors, right? So it's not as if I imagine people are not talking politics and reading all the time, right? And so explain to me how that can coexist with the blindness, because I imagine, I mean, I debated once, Rabbi Riskin, right? The eminent rabbi of Efrat, Shlomo Riskin, nice man. I certainly don't think that Shlomo Riskin would say he's blind. I think Shlomo Riskin would say he has a different perspective than yours, given his understanding of the realities in Israel-Palestine.
So parenthetically, I just say that Rabbi Riskin has a certain connection to the work of Roots. Perhaps he's changed a little bit since you've talked to him. I don't know when you talked to him.
Maybe it was a while ago, yeah.
But for me, the point that you are bringing up is a matter of universal human psychology. And thanks to the work of Roots, my mind has been opened not just to Palestinians, but to this psychological point that we're about to make. And everyone who's listening knows what I'm about to say, which is that George Washington had slaves. How could that be? How could that be?
Thomas Jefferson, right?
And we can go on. And we can talk about the views of most of the people on this call probably 30 years ago about gays. Didn't we see what our society is doing to them? Didn't we see? And what about racial justice today in America? It turns out just in the past 2 or 3 years that we're opening our minds to things that were in front of us for the past 10, 20, 50, 100, etc. years, and we didn't see. How could it be that human beings don't see the most obvious things? So I'm not going to answer the question, but it's a fact that we don't see most of the sensory perceptions. How can I say this? We don't process the meaning of what we physically see unless our minds, our moral minds, have been trained to see it. And it's frightening to think of this, which means that it's very minute. I'm blind to things that I don't know what I'm blind to. So I sometimes say to myself, how could it be that many people that I know, including me, eat meat? How could it be?
Right.
I'm pretty sure in another 30 years, if I'm alive, I'm going to look back and say, how did I do that? So yes, the smartest people in the world, including me, can be blind in the past and the present.
And in terms of the path forward towards a transformation, I'm wondering if it seems to me there was a moment in the United States during the civil rights movement when, even though it wasn't that, millions of people were getting together in one another's homes, something about what the civil rights movement was able to do and the way it was magnified in the media did lead some group of white Americans to have some kind of reckoning, to rethink things, which created a political space for the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. How do you have any sense of how this transformation in consciousness that you are talking about on a relatively small scale, on a human level, how it could take place at scale? What could happen that would shake Israeli Jews and make them think in a fundamentally different way?
I don't have an insightful answer. Just like I'm pretty sure that before Martin Luther King, no one knew how it would happen. And he himself didn't know, right, what the effect of his work would be. He had faith that one has to take responsibility. So my answer sounds to me pretty lame. My answer is just to scale it up 1,000-fold. And I can say that in the work of Roots, we began in Gush Etzion between Bethlehem and Hebron. We have the only joint Israeli-Palestinian community center in the whole West Bank. But 4 years ago, we expanded to creating a second center in the Jordan Valley. And 2 years ago, we began to expand to creating a third center in Samaria between Ramallah and Nablus in Hebrew Shechem. And I can also say, without giving any details, that two mayors of cities in Samaria, Jewish cities between Ramallah and Shechem, have approached me in the past 2 months asking to expand the work of Roots to their cities. And they seem to be very sincere. They're not just doing it as a fig leaf. So I have a little bit of hope, a little bit.
Let me ask a difficult question, which is, it seems to me, when one thinks about theories of change, there's the notion that you convince people, you change their hearts, right? But Frederick Douglass also said, power concedes nothing without a demand, right? In which he was talking about the fact that people also change because they're forced to change, because they recognize that if they don't change, they might lose something. They might be in some kind of danger, right? The boycott, divestment, sanctions movement is partly based on that premise. Maybe they want to change hearts and minds, but they want Israeli Jews to suffer economically, maybe culturally, in some way, psychologically, in order to make them rethink, right? I'm not equating the two, but Hezbollah would say, perhaps, that Israel didn't leave southern Lebanon because they were given flowers and candy. They left southern Lebanon because the Hezbollah fought them, right? And I know, I've heard, I think there are many Palestinians, maybe Israelis, who might say that Hamas has gotten more from its military tactics than the Palestinian Authority has gotten from its security cooperation. So there's obviously violent pressure is one thing, nonviolent pressure is another. But tell me how you think about this question of the legitimacy of Palestinian pressure on Israel, as opposed to simply, kind of an effort at changing hearts.
Okay, so first I just want to say a sentence about your previous question about the scaling up. I forgot to say that in addition to the work of Roots, there's over 100 other organizations in Israel and in Palestine that are trying to move us towards reconciliation. And one of the things these organizations have to do is to band together. And that's the work of ALMEP, partially the Alliance for Middle East Peace. And it also has to do with the money that the American Congress, $250 million, has now devoted to our organizations, these reconciliation, people-to-people reconciliation organizations. And actually the American government, the State Department, is, in the way it's explaining the grant money available, they are trying to bring the small organizations to work together, to partner together. So that's part of the work of these little organizations coming together to amplify our effect by strategic partnership. Okay, that's the previous question. Now your present question. So many people know that the Israeli peace movement, the Israeli left, was decimated by the Second Intifada. Mm-hmm. Someone who talks about this an awful lot is Yossi Klein Halevi. Many perhaps have read his book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor. He himself says he's suffered from the effects of this Second Intifada until about 2 years ago. And it took him that long to begin to break out of it. He was a peace activist until the Second Intifada. So we see that as far as Israeli psychology goes, violence on the side of the Palestinians doesn't seem to have worked. It really seems to have boomeranged against them. Right? We were on the cusp, perhaps, of a peace agreement before the Second Intifada, and it looks like they shot themselves in the foot. They shot us and they shot themselves in the foot. And now we're still trying to recover from the trauma of the Second Intifada. Now, is that a universal law in all conflicts, that violence on one hand only hardens the other side? Or is it perhaps especially true in the Jewish case, with the trauma that we have in our 2,000-year and more history, in which any present trauma connects to past trauma and is amplified a hundredfold. So that could be. It could be that we're a case in which violence against us just makes us more obstinate to, with our backs against the wall, to fight the enemy. But on the other hand, of course, the things you said in historical examples and other conflicts hold some water. So do I know the answer there? If I don't know the answer, and I'm fortunate I'm not a Palestinian, I don't have to struggle with this issue. Perhaps you want me to say, am I going to be happy or sad if the Palestinians engage in certain acts of nonviolent resistance that make my life miserable? I have no way of answering that question. But for me, I don't have to answer it. I just have to continue in the work of Roots, of building bridges, of taking responsibility, of doing what I can. There are a lot of things the Palestinians are going to do that I'm not responsible for.
On the question of violence, obviously there's violence on both sides, and the Israeli state is much more powerful, has much more violence at its disposal than Palestinians do. And in addition to that, there has been many reports, for those who follow this, of settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, particularly during the olive harvest and continuing. And I would love for you to help talk about the sociology, the psychology of what it is that is producing these attacks, and what can be done. What can be done to stop it?
First of all, I'll say that this is not my strong point. I'm more a philosopher and a reconciler than a political and social analyst. My partner, Shul Yudelman in Roots, has a lot to say about that question. You can interview him sometime.
Okay.
So to me, it's clear that the return of the Jewish people to the land of the Tanakh, to the land of the Bible, the reconnection to the experience of settling the land, just like was done in the time of Joshua, in the time of King David, etc. The learning of Bible, what we call on eye level, putting the Bible in your backpack, going out into the fields and reading the verses and walking in the footsteps of Abraham and of Joshua and of David the Melech, King David, all of that has brought a tremendous vibrancy to Israeli Judaism that I'm part of and I benefit from and I love. But at the same time, it's released a groundswell within our hearts and with our Jewish identities of the capacity for biblical violence. And it's frightening. For over 2,000 years, the rabbinic tradition has developed in order to, among other things, to modify and attenuate the violence of the Bible. I mean, many are familiar with it. And as a teacher of Talmud, I deal with this all the time. The way the rabbis treat the death penalty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The way the rabbis reinterpret, for example, King David's acts of war as acts of war against the study partner, of doing war and inserting Torah, right? It's all there, but partially in the Zionist movement and the religious Zionist movement, partially by design, but even more simply by the existential wellsprings that have been released inside of us.
Yes.
We're going backwards. We're going back to biblical morality. On a very, very visceral level, that is not, it's not a matter of reinterpreting halakha. It's a matter of things happening inside our religious psyche, which on one hand, again, are very, very powerful and beautiful, of making religion more real and visceral and connected to reality. But on the other hand, there are terrible, terrible dark sides to it.
Yes, yes, yes. You're saying something that seems to me extremely important, and I want to ask you more about it. I mean, there are those who would argue that there is in the entire nature of the idea of the creation of a Jewish state, of taking Zionism, taking the desire for return from something which is at the theological, spiritual level that you're praying for, to turning it into a political and military movement that inevitably takes this golem, right? This monster that the rabbis had tried to shackle in the wake of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, by, as you say, taking all the military and political stories, which and the deep violence that's there in books like Joshua and Judges and is imagined in Deuteronomy, and basically turning it into basically confining it within the Beit Midrash, confining it within the rabbinic tradition, that inevitably, once you bring these energies out with a process of conquest and taking land and the creation of a state with an army, that there is no escaping the fact that this is going to be unleashed. And so I'm really interested in how you think within the context of a Jewish sovereignty project, it's possible to put a moral boundary around this, because it's not as if, I mean, I don't tell you, it's not as if these people, as you say, it's in the text itself, right? The story of how, the story of how Bnei Yisrael took the land, right, was not through, whatever. It was not through a nonviolent process, right? It was through a process that looks that can look exterminationist. So talk to me about how that is even possible to do.
Okay. You twice used the word inevitable, and once said no escaping. So
I'm playing devil's advocate, but I want you to tell me that I'm wrong.
Right. So that's where I have to push back. From a historical and a social psychological perspective, you can't say inevitable. You can't say no escaping. You can only say, looking back with hindsight, that's what is happening partially. Could it have been different, and could it be different in the future? Of course it could. Of course it could. Let me just point out that in the halakhic system, it's very clear. It's very clear in the halakhic system that what was commanded upon the Jews, the Israelites, to do to the Palestinians, right? To do to the local Canaanites, that was only vis-a-vis the 7 Canaanite nations. And the Talmud says explicitly they're gone from the world. And therefore, for all intents and purposes, it's clear in the halakhic literature that those commandments are a dead letter. It's clear. So the halakhic system already has within it the understanding and the teaching that when we come back to the land of Israel, as we've done today, it's a different story. It's a different story. But the problem is we're not, even we religious Jews are not living it out halachically. We're living it out viscerally.
Right.
We're living it out in the culture we've created, and culture again and again, of course, trumps religion, right? It trumps halakha.
Right.
So of course it's possible. And indeed, part of the work of Roots is creating what Hadassah Fruman, the widow of Rabbi Menachem Fruman, who you mentioned earlier, which he calls Zionism too. We have to move beyond where we were until now, with the emphasis on one more fact on the ground and another settlement, whether that was in 1910 or 1930 or today. And we have to move to creating a moral Zionism, a Zionism that doesn't ignore our neighbors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do I know how to do that? No. Do I know, am I certain it's going to happen? No. Is it part of my life's mission? Yes. It begins with meeting the other. I believe, and I deeply believe this, that when you meet the other in a deep encounter and you listen deeply and he listens to you, You're going to go back to the Beit Midrash, and you're going to go back to the culture of Zionism differently. You're going to interpret culture, you're going to interpret religion, halakha, differently. We need more and more Jews and Palestinians. We need more and more rabbis. We need more and more settlers. We need more and more everyone in Israel to have that transformative experience of meeting the other as an equal, and then going back to our Zionism and our religion and our halakha and our Beit Midrash and our synagogues, and interpreting in light of the experiences, the true experiences that we've had, that the other is a human being with a legitimate national identity and a legitimate connection to this land that has to be respected.
Right, right. And certainly one can take hope from the fact that the as you say, the halachic tradition, the Jewish tradition, has been extraordinarily innovative and daring and creative. You know, and has that capacity.
Again, the work has already been done in the Beit Midrash.
Right.
For part of what I'm saying, it's not that we just have to create it; it's already there.
Right. There are no more idolaters. There are no more Amalekim. Right. Right. Let me ask you one more question, and this maybe I've nudged you from the left a bit, but let me nudge you from the right a little bit in the way that I imagine might be more common that you might get in Alon Shvut. So, what about? I'm curious about your one of the word that you hear always in the mainstream Jewish conversation immediately is Hamas, right? So, oh, you want to live together. You want to live together. Everyone's going to be so nice to one another. It's all great, right? Hamas, Islamism. I'm curious about what you have learned in your interactions with Palestinians about political Islam and about Hamas itself as a movement, and how you think about that within the framework of this vision that you have.
I don't know if I have a lot to say about this. I've learned, and it should be no surprise, that there are deep disagreements within the Islamic world. I've learned that my Palestinian partners claim that Hamas is not the true Islam, that Hamas has it wrong, that most Palestinians don't agree with Hamas. And I don't know what else I can say about that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But I still come back to my fundamental point that you have to talk. Mm-hmm. And I am willing to, and we do talk to everyone, all Palestinians. I wouldn't refrain from talking to Palestinian who's an affiliate of Hamas. And again, I believe that our religious perspectives can be altered through the face-to-face unmediated connection and to the other.
Let me close by asking you one last question. And this is a question I imagine that in different ways others on this call may have wrestled with as well. I imagine that you every day are interacting with friends, neighbors, even family perhaps, who have a radically different view than you on this question, and whose views you might even feel are fundamentally immoral, racist, even if they're lovely people and you love them as people. I think one of the things that I wrestle with personally is how to hold those two things. If I decide to put the politics to the side when I go to shul or when I hang out, am I betraying Palestinians by having a nice Shabbat meal with a bunch of people whose views I find really reprehensible? But if I'm not willing to do that, if I'm calling out people politically every day, then I'm not it's hard to live in a Jewish community unless you live in a very unusual one. So tell me how you balance that in your life.
So first I have to remember that just like I think that they are fundamentally immoral, right, they may think the same thing about me.
Absolutely.
The second thing is I have to learn from experience that there's almost no chance of me changing someone's mind in a conversation around the Shabbat table. And if it's not going to work, then it's not worth it. There's no value in it. What I have learned is that you have to be very careful, and you have to sound people out, and you have to see who you can talk to and who you cannot talk to, and to what degree can you reveal everything you think. And the purpose has to be, and I'm not good at this, but the purpose has to be not to get in a soapbox and proclaim the truth, but the purpose has to be to say what they may hear, what they may be capable of absorbing. And that's hard. That's hard. And the last point I'll make is that although it's very rare that you can change someone's mind on these fundamental issues, sometimes you can convince them to meet the other side. And whereas what I might say to my fellow Jew won't help at all, but what my Palestinian friend may say to them actually in most cases does help.
Right.
All I have to do is get them to come to an event.
Right.
And every person has their comfort zone. This one may want to come to the Roots Run for Reconciliation, in which Palestinian Israelis run together. This one may come to a Ramadan dinner, an iftar meal, because she likes food. This one may come to a discussion of Islam. He won't want to meet a Palestinian, but to meet a Muslim is okay, even though that's the same thing, right? It depends how you frame it. This one will come to a discussion of cooking. This one will come to interfaith dialogue group. And then you get them to meet the other side, and the human contact very often does something.
Well, on that note, thank you, Rabbi Schlesinger, so much for spending the time with us. Really fascinating. I'd encourage everyone to learn more about Roots Shorashim. Did you want to say one last thing?
That's it. I just wanted to say www.friendsofroots.net. Friendsofroots.net. And don't go to friendsofroots.org. Friendsofroots.net.
Okay, friendsofroots.net. I encourage all of you to look at it. Next week, we'll be back our regular time on Friday. We're actually going to look at a part of the world we don't really talk about very much, but is in the news a lot, which is we're going to have a conversation about Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine. And that'll be next Friday, the 14th. And thank you all so much. Thank you again, Rabbi Schlesinger, for spending the time with us. I really appreciate it. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.